Alright, in this video, let's discuss the volcanic eruption from back in January of 2022 that I think by now most of us are familiar with. The famous Tonga Hapai eruption that on 15th of January 2022 produced the largest explosion recorded in the atmosphere in the last 200 years ever since the records started. More powerful than any volcanic eruption and more powerful than any atomic bomb. With the only eruption that might have been even more powerful being the explosion of Krakatoa in 1883. But in this video we're going to be tackling a somewhat intriguing question that a lot of us have basically felt. Here we're talking about recent heat waves, dramatic changes in temperature in 2023 and 2024, and the question basically being, okay, so is there a chance that a lot of these heat waves could have been the result of this volcano and the amount of water it released in the upper atmosphere? So in other words, the question here is there a chance that the volcano here might have produced these ridiculously high temperatures, explaining titles like this: Monday was hottest recorded day on Earth, uncharted territory. I think most of us have seen these press releases by now, and they've actually been coming out pretty regularly since 2023. So let's discuss this in a little bit more detail, briefly talk about the recent study that kind of analyzed all of this, potentially settling this once and for all, and also briefly discuss some of the other effects this volcano had on a lot of life nearby. And by the way, if you want to see some of the previous videos about the science and about the discoveries from this volcano, check out the videos in the description. But first, a quick reminder of what exactly happened. Here we actually had at least 4 underwater thrusts that replaced an enormous amount of rock, ash, and sediment, resulting in the largest atmospheric explosion on the record. The explosion whose shockwaves traveled across the planet several times. And in this case, this plume reached the height of about 58 kilometers or 36 miles, which basically delivered a lot of different materials into the upper atmosphere. But it didn't all just go up, a lot of it also went down into the oceans. As a matter of fact, a lot of ash here covered the surrounding ocean floor for at least several months, with certain locations having ash of approximately 1.5 meters in depth. And turns out that these effects were super dramatic. It might have completely decimated certain types of marine life in a relatively large area around the volcano. Apparently in this area there are quite a lot of hot springs and a lot of locations with quite a lot of life, and it was actually visited by previous missions studying the biology of these extreme environments. And when the scientists returned here in 2022 and 2023, comparing the footage from the expeditions, as you can see right here, there was a tremendous difference. Some animals, like for example crabs, potentially survived, but a lot of mollusks and a lot of animals that are much slower all seem to have perished. Although the exact effects on this particular niche are still not really clear, and so the researchers behind the study you can find in the description are going to be going back here in 2026 just to see how all of this changed and if this area recovered, and if so, by how much. Mostly because these hydrothermal vents are usually extremely biodiverse. There's a lot of types of life here, and suddenly after this volcano there was practically nothing. But that's obviously some of the new discoveries from within the ocean. What about the atmosphere and all of this gas released? Well, as we've discussed in some of the previous videos, what made this volcano somewhat different and somewhat unique is the fact that it was underwater. And as a result of this, it actually released a huge amount of water vapor into the upper atmosphere. And as you might know, water vapor is a relatively strong greenhouse gas. And so back in 2022 and 2023, various researchers potentially suggested that we might actually experience a kind of a localized heating event because this might have shifted the temperature balance on planet Earth. So for example, one study suggested that the overall temperature will increase by about 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 Fahrenheit in at least one of the next 5 years following the event. And because water vapor might stay in the stratosphere for at least 8 years, this might also make winters a little bit hotter as well. And not just in one hemisphere, potentially both. On top of this, a lot of these emissions would also to some extent influence the ozone, potentially leading to a slight increase in the ozone hole, which surprisingly was measured to be much larger in September of 2023 at 26 million square kilometers in size. And naturally, it also released a lot of sulfur dioxide, like all volcanic eruptions, and though normally sulfur dioxide leads to the cooling effect, In this case, it was suggested to be not as powerful as the water vapor. But in this case, these studies were all basically based on predictions and modeling, not actual observations. And well, now, after basically 2.5 years, we do have observations based on the evidence from NASA and NOAA satellites, and surprisingly, the conclusion is practically the opposite. And so let's, discuss the study and the overall discovery. Now, as always, you can find this in the description below. And here the study by Dr. Schoeberl and his team basically focused on just one thing: collecting and analyzing data from the NASA and NOAA satellites in order to correlate the amount of aerosols and amount of water particles in the upper atmosphere to potential changes in temperature. And luckily for us, both government agencies have a lot of satellites doing just that. For some of them, the whole purpose is just to measure various aerosols. And well, here's what they discovered in a nutshell. For example, what this shows us is the amount of aerosols of water at approximately 25 kilometers in altitude between 2022 and 2023. And here you can clearly see when the eruption happened, but you can also see how the water dispersed pretty quickly and was almost completely gone by 2023. In comparison, here's how this correlates with the overall temperature during this year. And notice how there doesn't actually seem to be a correlation, and as a matter of fact, if you look right there, it's actually a reverse correlation. During the part of 2022, the temperatures dropped in the location where the aerosols from the volcano were present, whereas during 2023, the overall temperatures were definitely higher. And so in essence, what this actually shows us is that despite increasing the water content in the atmosphere by approximately 10%, this bizarre powerful eruption actually increased the cooling of the planet, extremely similar to every other volcanic event. And furthermore, by analyzing the overall balance of energy on the planet and comparing it to other aerosols, they basically discovered that this eruption most definitely reduced the overall energy inside the Earth's climate system. Or, in other words, it produced an overall cooling effect. And yeah, I'm pretty sure none of us felt it. The last 2 years were not cool at all. Yet the data from every single satellite does actually suggest that this volcano cooled the planet and did not make it hotter. And that's actually despite a very unusual mystery in this eruption. It did not produce as much sulfur dioxide like a lot of other eruptions, and it's not entirely clear why. But it's quite clear that by beginning of 2024, pretty much most of the aerosols produced by this volcano have already settled out, with the water anomaly being completely gone and mostly just being present in the lower atmosphere. But once again, surprisingly, the overall cooling effect is also being kind of small. And so I guess in some sense, if it wasn't for this volcano, the temperatures could have been actually even a little bit higher. But then obviously the next question is, so why is it so hot then? What's happening? So what can possibly change the temperature by so much, so quickly, and to such extreme extent? Well, right now the scientists behind this paper believe that it's very likely a combination of a lot of greenhouse gases from the human activity mixed with the very powerful El Niño effects that were quite prominent in 2023 and 2024. Here's actually a really interesting graph showing us the global temperature correlated with the strong El Niño years when we expect hotter temperature and La Niña years when the temperature should be a little bit lower. And the correlation here is pretty strong. Except that maybe one thing. At the moment, right now, there is no La Niña or El Niño, and so 2024 should not be as hot as it is, which of course suggests other factors at play. And we'll actually discuss some potential explanations in some of the videos in the description. Except for El Niño, there's actually another peak cycle that we're experiencing right now, and it has something to do with the moon. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but check out the video in the description to find out more. And so overall the conclusion from this study right here is that, well, looks like this particular volcano, even though it released a lot of water into the atmosphere, still had a somewhat small cooling effect overall, and definitely did not cause a warming effect we've been experiencing for the past 2 years. Now, human-based activity is definitely slowly adding to the effects, but as I mentioned, it's unlikely to have caused it so quickly. And so the only real conclusion we have from the study is that all of this heating is unlikely to have come from the Tonga volcano. Despite its power and despite all of the water, it did not seem to increase the temperature. And interestingly enough, based on the evidence, it might have also not been responsible for increasing the ozone hole. Here the evidence once again suggests an absolutely minimal impact on the levels of the ozone as well, at least based on the evidence we have so far from the last 2 years. But I guess we'll have even more evidence in the next year or so, as more and more data from these satellites becomes available. But more importantly, we'll probably know more about this unusual heat wave by next year as well, mostly because we now expect El Niño to be finished and La Niña to start. And as I mentioned, during La Niña, usually the temperatures go down. And so if 2025 is surprisingly lower in temperature, this might give us a little bit of a hint on what's going on. But I don't want to make any speculations, and more importantly, I don't want climate denial people to come here and make some kind of a case out of this, because that's not what this video is about. The whole point of the video is that the volcano was not responsible for the heating or even the cooling. It seems to have produced like zero effect whatsoever, which is kind of surprising. And so on that note, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon by joining a channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.